is beyond more impressive.
And one of the cool things that happened,
For you, Professor Keen?
This is Professor Kane.
Yes. Can I ask just a couple questions about the schedule again?
Sure.
Okay, so as I understand it, let's see, we will meet outside Notre Dame on Monday, the 23rd of May.
Right.
Yep, okay. And Accent will let us into our places on the 22nd or that Sunday.
No, on Monday.
Oh, on Monday they will let us in.
Right. So most students are flying Sunday, which gets you in the next day in Paris Monday morning.
Okay,
And you'll take the RER line into a central station, switch on the metro to get you close to Accent. And then they'll basically be fielding students all morning long because you're all on different flights. And hopefully we'll get the sheet that shows all your roommates. So in case there's a roommate coming much later in the afternoon, Axum won't need to send them a taxi. They can just meet you back at the apartment if your roommate's coming in later. They'll probably give out one set of keys per student who's there in the morning to collect people.
okay,
So we'll figure that out later because they're working with a new agency this spring. And so maybe by the time we do the soiree in late April, they'll have the list. So we'll know exactly where you'll live and who your roommates will be definitively. And then we can work on logistics in terms of who gets the keys and who gets the apartment first. So we can all settle down that first Monday.
okay, sounds good. And then I think the final day was July 31st, which I believe is a Sunday. Yes. So that's just kind of the last day, and we depart or travel elsewhere anywhere after that 31st.
No, I believe the 31st is the last day that we're going to be there as faculty.
Okay.
I think your contract with the housing, you can double check with Ramona, is the week before. Our program's over the week before.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sounds good.
So we're going to stay on, just do some residual stuff. We're going to start to work with the local agency there too on the potential for the growth of the programs like this. But our last week, I don't have the calendar in front of me, but your final exam is like that Friday, late April, right, late July. Then we have our group dinner, and then Saturday it's kind of you collect your stuff and you're out of there that weekend.
Okay.
You're welcome to stay in Europe, obviously, but I believe it's the 24th or 25th is your last day. You have to check the final records there.
All right. Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Sure. So we are set for the 24th in the afternoon. We get one more chance to get last minute questions asked by students. Hopefully we'll know who your roommates are. And we'll do it at our house in the backyard. We overlook the lake. It's a nice place to do this. And we'll take photographs of everybody so we kind of know who everybody is. And we'll send that file out to everybody so we can place names to faces finally into the pandemic here. And you can start to share your desires for independent study work, for travel programs on the weekends. Bob Greenstreet, our past dean, will talk to you about coming to London some Saturday morning. He'll meet you guys at the Trafalgar Square and give you a tour Saturday and Sunday, the weekend of your choice. That's free for us. But if we can get going now, because I know Andrew has to get off to their class by 6:30 here. This is a great crescendo to our language of architecture and the classical language here. Because once we leave the Pantheon here, it kind of drifts into the 19th century, and then things change really rapidly in terms of the language of architecture. But this is really a seminal point here because we have the biggest, largest piece of neoclassical architecture by Jean Germain Soufflot. So let me write out his name here. J, G, and Soufflot. And he's on this site because the kings of France are bloodline, and to sire a son is very important. And then to watch their health is very important because sometimes that threatens the whole country if a king gets ill. And Louis XV became ill, and in his prayers to God, he committed to, in 1744, if he recovered from his illness, he'd replace the dilapidated church of the Abbey of Saint-Geneviève, which is up on the hill, and I'll talk about it in a second, with a more grander, worthy structure for the patron saint of Paris, who's Saint Genevieve, Saint-Geneviève. So on this site then is going to be the glory of Paris in terms of responding to the Catholic faith in France here, really to compete on the level what the Italians accomplished with St. Peter's and Christopher Wren accomplished with St. Paul's in England. So the language of this architecture is going to be really rote neoclassical, really stripped down. So it's in that same period of time of Gabriel, look at the T. Trianon, but this isn't a diminutive building. This is very, very tall. It's not as tall as Invalides, but it's a very impressive dome in Paris because it's actually on a bit of, well, not really a mountain, but it's the hilliest area on the Rive Gauche. As I think I mentioned before, that the south side of the bank, the Rive Gauche, the left bank, got developed faster because it was terrain that went up a mountain, which was drier all the time. On the other side of the river to the north, it was kind of swampland, so it didn't grow as fast as the south side did. So towering over the hillside, looking down on the valley towards the river, was Mont Saint-Geneviève. Ideal place to put your iconic singular dome here. So what we see then in plan type here is a really strong cruciform. Let me put it right in the middle of the lens here. Cruciform plan. So it's equal axis. If you take away the narthex here, 4 exact things. So it's really kind of a great geometrical study of classical language and plan type. And then an elevation to surmount that with a beautiful dome that's tiered off of its drum. And then have the frontispiece face down the boulevard, which is actually the Rue Soufflot now, named after the architect, which takes us all the way down under Haussmann's planning to the Palace of Luxembourg and Luxembourg Gardens. But on all 4 sides, the intention was to have the exact same elevation that would rotate around. But what they found early on, and then more trouble in the 19th and 20th century, is that, that the foundations in the hill itself, because of subterranean quarries down there, wasn't as strong as it needed to be for the weight of all this stone. Because unlike Invalides, which is really sort of a wooden frame skinned in stone, this is a completely stone piece of architecture. So the stuff that would have been sort of open air and all the windows on the side, for the need of making it sort of interior-related when the revolution took away its principle as a church and moved it into an acropolis, a pantheon for great French people, they also had to fill in the windows just to strengthen the supports for the dome above. So as the building had sketchy science on its foundations, it also then had some political moves which would take away from the language of the original intent. So it basically bops around between an ecclesiastical building to a non-ecclesiastical, back to the Bourbons and the restored, back again. And so it's flip-flopping back in use and now finds itself as a pantheon to great French individuals. So if you start with the plan type here really quick, we'll find that that nice cruciform plan is really, really super strong biaxial symmetry. And of course, crowning that biaxial symmetry is that wonderful dome that's a circle inscribed in a square. Right down the center line there. And because then the drum of that dome comes down and has to be supported on 4 corners, these massive piers, not unlike St. Peter's in Rome, for those who make the effort to visit that or get there one day, the piers themselves do all the work there to distribute that load evenly across and then have the outside rings of the structure of the plan then come in and support, almost like in a pyramid if you work top down, that as it splays out, there's equal amounts of structural pressure counteracting the forces of the dome wanting to fail and to come down to ground zero, the dead weight of all the architecture beneath it. So the smaller square is begat by a larger square outside of that. then the 4 equal terraces on either side then support that. So it's all kind of crowning toward the element of structure where it may seem like it's lineal, but in fact, all the structures coming down in that sort of pyramidal form down to the ground there. But with the weakened foundations, they had to take away some of the natural light applications on the inside. It still is an incredibly spectacular building because now in its sort of non-ecclesiastical realm, it's really a powerful statement about the liberty and politics of the environment of the French Revolution. So what's really lovely about this site, and we're going to draw it from this corner, so we see a little bit of the really great prototypical Roman facade. And Soufflot in the 40s was in Rome doing an architectural tour as a young draftsperson, learning about that great classical language. So he brought it back to Paris with him and basically convinced the king that that's the appropriate church to be built there in his honor for his regaining his health. So that corner is going to show us a bit of the temple, and then the narthex, which actually gets added on from the original plan, which is going to stop here. They added this narthex of a temple front to it to connect to the 4 equal sides that you see on the inside of it. And that'll give us a sense of the scale of this off of a major boulevard. And what's lovely about this site in Paris, not only does it have the Pantheon, but it's got a great boulevard now from Haussmann that sets up this elevation for about a half a mile down to the Luxembourg Gardens, which is like the epicenter of the green space for the Latin Quarter, the 5th and 6th arrondissement. And you got this charming dome then that surmounts Paris on the whole south side. But then just across the street, just over here, which we visit not on the same day, this is sort of central to Paris, so you can come here multiple times, but on different days, because they're both kind of worthy of it, we visit the bibliothèque, the library, Saint-Geneviève. And that was done about, well, it's actually close to the finish of, by the time this was finished into the 18th century, you're getting close to the time then within, maybe 100 years later, they build this sort of classical modernist version of a library adjacent to the Pantheon. And it seems kind of sublime from the elevation when you walk by it, but the richness is on the inside. It's a spectacle of modernity from 1855. So we move from the stripped down language of the Pantheon a century before, when it's finally started and completed into the 19th century. But the idea comes from more the core of neoclassical values. But that idea of the modern spirit and the clarity of it is surmised by Labrousse later on. So that's another drawing to come later on, but it's just adjacent to this. And then to kind of complete the neighborhood, there's a beautiful jewel of an eclectic church which spans sort of the Gothic into the Renaissance over here on this corner of this big quadrangle, because the Pantheon sits within a big Place de Pantheon, obviously, and then the boulevard comes up and the ring road goes around it. So on this corner, on this edge, and down this side are major pieces of French architectural accomplishment. So it's a really exciting part of town. Plus, you're on the peak of the city in terms of the central area. I'm not sure if Montmartre is taller than this part of the Saint-Geneviève, but certainly the dome here and the dome in Sacré-Cœur dominate the city sort of profile. So we're going to leave the plan here and then come back to it, because it also has the presence of what it means to go inside the Pantheon later and what really draws people to it beyond the architecture. But first, let's look at that temple type. So coming off this boulevard here from the west, the public side, toward the eastern procession, toward the central piece. And by now we're deep into Renaissance language, where that's the body of the church and sort of the global vision of mankind, age of humanism, the singularity of the faithful and the inside there being this church presence first. The idea was to bring it into the presence of the architecture from the Renaissance and the classical language. It's such a large building that the plinth it's on is almost, by the time you get to the top, it's taller than eye level. So our horizon line is actually beneath, inside the stair level. And you can see the stairs here kind of vanish to it. So the top of the stair, when you rise up here, is tall enough that it eclipses a human's height, and then comes down this other side as you wrap around the corner down the left side. And so on top of that, coming down to our horizon line, and then this one being vanished way off here to the left of the page, we'll see those 2 points, one very close to us. And so the top of the the cornice line for the building then races down to this point, and the entablature races down to that point. And so the front face of our box is just a rectangle in perspective. And that's the skin, the outside skin, the classical language of that temple type. In this case, it's a hex style, 6 columns. And then it has another tier of a 7th and 8th around the side, which starts the portico, the actual space before you retreat, you get inside toward the narthex of it until you get into the plan of the church here. So what we'll do here, because it's a very oblique view of that front, because if we did the frontispiece by itself, we wouldn't be able to catch the dome. And this is one of the things when you get close, views when you can get close to the corner of it, you actually see the majesty of the dome in adjacency with this. You've already kind of drawn it quickly, that first lecture where we talked about all buildings in elevation, where you see this view at elevation and see the scale of this relative to that. So obviously this doesn't dominate the dome dominates the composition, but in this case, it seems powerful because we're so close to that. So we're simply going to start with the array of columns that are here at the corner. So there's our 1 column corner and then one over here as well. So we've got 2 done. We just need to put the other 4 inside here. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. By the time you get to the 4th one, they kind of collapse on each other. So there's no space between the columns past the first 3. And so that sets up that hex style frontispiece of the classical language that Soufflot wanted to be the western edge of this, the public face where people were going to enter with our tickets, and the public has come since it was a church and now that it's a Pantheon to men. So when you step around the corner though, we come to a double set of columns, which creates the portico. So we have those 2 more as prominent features that led us into this first section of the Pantheon, that creates kind of a public space out here where people congregate in the evening because it's outside the church proper. So the entablature wraps around and it comes over to this end and becomes important for those columns as well, and then terminates. Then we come to that cruciform shape of the plan over here. We'll see a little of that perspective. But first we want to complete the language here in terms of the architecture. On top of this column capital will sit the slab of the entablature, which will run the whole way. And then I've got that point indicated to you as the center point between the 6 columns. And that's where the pediment's going to sit all the way down to this end. So it's a classical temple type based on Roman, based on the Greek culture, that's now to edify the language of Saint-Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris. And of course, it gets extrapolated into meaning a pantheon to the great men and women of France. And I believe it's only men and women of France proper, but there's one German we'll talk about later who's interred in the crypt as well. So that simply then steps back, we saw in that piece, until we get to the final crowning element of the cornice line above the way we wrap around the corner here. And that's that whole section that will start to articulate now. The stair comes down once you're at the end of the portico, so a twin to this angle comes down over here, and that's the extent of the stair level coming down in this direction toward the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève, and then on this end coming down to the street that side. So you've got sort of this nice temple type that really is there just as the portal. It's the door, it's the entryway to this great space on the interior. So there is a bit of a connector piece between this then and the cruciform plan, and that gives our language of what's going to happen before it starts to work its way around, and we kind of lose sight of the left side of that cruciform as it comes back here. So we're only really sketching from this view shed. If I come really close and tilt this properly, right about that view, where we're going to see just this turnaround to this corner, and this will go off the page. We'll have a glimpse of the dome up above. So we'll come back into some value here to make sure we've got a space underneath the side of this entry protocol here. But now we're going to go up into the dome level and show the language of the dome sitting on top of its drum. So the first thing we're going to do is move to the basin of the dome itself. We're going to run that circle around and then complete that arc as if it would complete in space around the edge of the last column, because we want to make sure that that is definitely a cylindrical space in space. And so we need to move that edge around that level. So we're seeing, in a sense, that almost like the backside of the ring of the dome itself. And then on top, because it's very difficult to really sense the curve of that, those little lines help out formulate the skin of that dome from this sense of perspective, coming down to touch that rim. And then on top of that, it's its cupola. Now, ringing around here are a series of columns at the drum, and the drum is what takes the weight of the dome that comes down, and it supports the dome and its little necking, and finally the drum distributes that, as we talked about, onto these four piers below. So this really tight tensile ring of steel inside there is taut to hold that cylinder together, which so it takes the load coming down along the ribs of the dome down to the plan type over here in sections. So that comes down, and then the shaft of the dome is actually inside the actual rim of it underneath in the drum. So we're going to have a cadence of these little columns. They're going to run up and follow the arc of our curve. And then as they meet the edge of this, we're going to start to see more and more in the same plane as they start to overlap, and the ones that are closest to us have the largest space. And those will come down to its twin to this level. And now I see the base of that drum. And so there's an arc of a circle that comes over here and then sets down to complete that language of those moving down in space. And so we see a little bit of the transfer of the circle to the square as it shifts to an octagon up here. So up here in plan, we see one side of an octagon, another, and then it breaks again. So they're gently moving from the pure circle to an octagonal volume first up above in plan. And that's kind of the blending as a sacrament in the Catholic faith of the baptismal font, where the heaven is circular, and the man, the structure for it is the square beneath. And the interstitial volume or shape that changes the circle and the square is the octagon. So we see that as a base then to the drum that sits on top of that. And then we'll see the ribs of the vault up here that come down and splay, and we'll work with value a little bit to kind of create a better sense of shading for that. Now, it'd be lovely to show the actual lighting inside here that Soufflot intended. And you can't really see this the way we're going to draw this. When we get there for your photograph of it, you'll see that in the actual planar elements of these walls here, it seems like there should be windows there, and they were intended, but the structure failed. And during construction, there was cracking in the stonework, in the masonry. And that was problematic. And they realized what the footing problem was for the building. So they had to stabilize the massiveness and the mural quality, and then eliminate that possibility of failure through the openings and making it light, because they had to support the weight of the dome up above. So not only it accomplished that effort, but it also accomplished the idea of making this more of an internal space, not to the glory of God, but the glory of the people that are interned here. And so having it closed off from natural light kind of is in sync with that change in functional form for the building. So when you'll see this in the stone, when you come up to it, you can actually see sort of a change in the coloration of the stone, where these massive light windows used to be in the skin of the elevation. And so if you'll read closely, as you walk up to it, you'll see kind of the halo of the window that used to be there. So the shape is still there in stonework, but it's one clean wall that's been infilled over the years. Now, what we're talking about here in terms of language, I've already mentioned that it's basically wrote neoclassical. But some of the drive toward this was a French determination to stitch together two of our time periods into merging history's dominance in French culture today. So there are two parts, and actually it's flipped in terms of how they're used in the calendar, but of time. So if you think about the Greco ideal, the Greek ideal of classical language, and the heroic quality of the language of volume and the form and the prose, you then got sort of a term that was used in the litany of services by some political priests who were trying to preach the idea of a certain type of language of French architecture that would merge the idea of the classical language and its favoritism of image with the volume of the Gothic. And that's called the Greco-Gothic ideal. And as we spoke about Alberti and the Renaissance, or Palladio, or people that talked about the classical theoreticians, there became some French philosophers, some French people who wrote about architecture, and one in particular, which probably is the most accessible to the public, was actually a French priest. And his name was Marc-Antoine Loger. And so while he was giving service, he realized that as a non-professional, he preferred the volume and the heroics of Gothic space, but he preferred the image of the classical language. And so most historians agree that this is probably the best unification of those in terms of the scale of the Gothic by using classical language. And it's not so much apparent out here because this seems like a civic building or state building. Much of Washington, D.C. has got the same type of language to it. Once you walk inside, though, it feels like more of a Gothic volume because of how Soufflot scaled the proportion between the language of the classical and the interior volume, which we won't get to in this sketch, but you certainly will get there in terms of our presence on the site this summer. So let's look a little bit into value now. And again, we'll simply select our key aspects of sunlight. And so since this is the western skin over here, we'll assume it's later in the afternoon, it's coming right down Rue Soufflot, and it's going to wash the whole western elevation with light, which means our whole secondary edge over here and between our columns and this whole side is going to receive less light than that western elevation. So we'll take this down all the way up to top here. Now up top, we've got the western part of the dome facing the same way as the temple. So this is all the white part. So we can start on this side and certainly the underside of the rim of the drum and this part, and then the left side of all the columns as we marched along here. Because even if you're on the west side, they've got a shade side to each round space on top, and the left side of the octagon, this one a little bit lighter. And then finally, as it makes the turn here and goes to this side, it'll become white, but then we kind of run out of paper stock there. And we'll have to pick that up photographically later on. But now at least establishes that we know what the sun and shade side is on the building. So around the corner, the plinth, the triangular plinth of the stairs that come down, and there may be as many as, 10 rises to take up here. So that's just about the height of the person, a little bit beyond that. And now to help the underside, we know that this space has got a volume to it, a depth to it. So from those paired columns over here and the frontispiece of the 6, there's a volume that we see the underside of this roof. So we can take from this column where it meets its entablature and go back to the right vanishing point, just really lightly. And that'll show where on the underside, this is cutting between the columns until we get to this corner. Then we take that line back to the left vanishing point. So if we go between column to column and there to there, and you can see now the sense of now we're underneath an open air portico behind those columns. And that one line vanishing back because it's horizontal like these goes to one point, and this line vanishes back to the left point, following all of our horizontal lines on the bottom and on the top. And so now with our light, shade, and shadow, this is light, this is shade. This is darker shade in there because it's parallel to the light source, so the least amount of light is seen under that actual plane up there. So under the entablature, we can make that plane of that under skin be a bit darker than the rest of the space. And eventually it kind of comes to that last column there. So we'll see that played together. And so that starts to create this idea you can walk into an exterior portical temple without actually being in the ecclesiastical or now Pantheon structure. So now we'll come back in with maybe a finer pencil and start to articulate some of the details of this, because it's not as quite as stripped down neoclassical as all that, because it is a Corinthian column space. So we can come up to the column capitals and draw on the arc of the top of those cylinders per capital. And make sure all those are coming out in the same perspective. To finally get to the end. And then do a little bit of a language of the acanthus leaf to show that it is Corinthian. And because of that, each one will have a base to it. And the base is above the eye level. So a little bit of an arc at the base of all those columns coming down. A little more prominent of the three that are closest to us in the corner. And then we can go to our little detail idea of how to make the columns. Right now, if you don't see the roundness up here, it could be a flat pilaster to make it seem more cylindrical. We'll arc that shadow line to be lighter on one side and darker on the other. So that arc can be taken down where the entablature throws that shade onto the shaft. Bring that down to the front six. And that helps make them seem like they're tubular now instead of just flat pieces of paper on our two-dimensional sketch. And we can give some dimension to the portico, which is stone that will be capped on top of that frontis piece and wrap around the corner. And of course, those cornice lines then cast shadows. And we'll do a little detail here to give some scale to this. If we put a person in distance on that horizon line walking up to this, about the height of the top of the stair, at the other end of this very large structure in Paris, are probably that tall. They come closer to us at the base of the stair. They might be that tall. So that kind of gives the presence of just how dominant this is for the neighborhood. But even an easier way to do this is to actually draw some residential architecture. And that's why there's the lines for these over on this side. And that is, we're going to draw some housing from the Rue Soufflot La Place up here. And just do an elevation of what turns out to be a 7-story building that eclipses at this height. So that's the height of a 7-story building across the place from the south side of the Pantheon. So we can simply then show shorter levels for the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the largest for the lower level here. And then simply put in just a little rhythm of fenestration per floor, just to hint at it. And that's another anthropomorphic scale indicator. We don't have to complete the whole building because it's not the subject, but it gives the idea of just how large the Pantheon is on this site when you see the scale of a window for an apartment being so small compared to the mass of the architecture up above. And the dark is a roof skin to it. And then when we come to the edge of this building, there's a little slip of a street that slivers in between this and its neighbor. So we can do that really quickly here and then show that neighbor coming down to our one vanishing point. So that could be a darker alley next to that. And then at that point, it comes back for our point and completes the edge of the partial square up here, which wraps around and plan to make a contemporary identity from the planning of Haussmann in the 19th century to make this a great place just to be from an urbanistic point of view, using the iconic Pantheon as the emblem at the top of the hill. So now we want to go back and do our whole values. Our value range right now, if you kind of squint, we lose a lot of change in value here. So what's really important is that the light's coming here and throws this on the wall behind the structure. A higher some have a deeper shadow line. So the shadow line runs back between the building, proper the interior up to the interior of the columns. So that line is deeper than the stone adjacent to it in terms of tone. And so that likes to seem like there's some type of lower, so it's predicting there. And so we'll come back to the edge of the columns and make sure that's a darker edge on both sides of that to crispen up the back edge of these columns as they go back in space. And probably the top deck of the stair line. And then we can enhance the dome itself, because when we go to the dome, we also, the colonnade is pulled away from the skin of the dome. The skin of the dome comes down to a drum atop this, which you don't see because of this frontispiece up here. But then that dome then comes down behind it. So back in here, then there is a shadow line that's projected by that on top of the cylinder behind the columns. And so that wraps light around that base, and we'll come to the left side of each column and show it a little bit darker as the sun moves around that skin. And obviously this corner is our important third of the sketch, but the dome is enough of a subject. We want to do some detail there, but we can't afford to detail this as much as we do this front third of the sketch. So we'll keep coming back into this corner and try to articulate the classical language here. So again, within the, show more of the canthus leaves here for the Corinthian order. And the shade side to those pieces. After one or two down this way, we'll stop that articulation because it's further from field. You get further from field in the sketch, you show less detail. And we'll keep washing dark next to the brightness of the columns. And then at one point, there are 3 doors, and they're all on the axis for the columns. So we came in the middle of the pediment, between the middle 6 columns, come down here, and then back into the space. We would find that front door probably behind our front column here, but if we show just one side of it, and its depth and darkness of being a dark brown space, and on either side of it, there's little twin doors to it. So one's on this side behind that door, and it runs down. We probably won't see the other one here, but if we can hint at it, that kind of gives, even though it's a very celebratory door, much taller than human scale, it kind of gives the idea of entry and just how tall the access points are for the Pantheon as well. We may want to keep this piece that segments out. It goes back in and pops out before it gets to the part where it rotates around its octagon. So it's darker right at that edge. It's probably not receiving direct light. We want to use that white or a brighter tone there to make that work. And then sit the building down on a nice plinth here, because right now it's a lot of stone we've drawn on the paper. So it's not being received by the paper proper. So if we took some ideas of line work, for instance, there is a paving pattern which surrounds the church proper. So if we put that down and using our left point well off the page and our right when it comes towards us, we can kind of hint at that change of language where they've removed or minimized automobile movement and made it very pedestrian right around this whole square, but still you come up with automobiles from Luxembourg Gardens and go around either left or right of the Pantheon. But once you're in the pedestrian corner, there are some flat tones here. So we can articulate that with some play of plane until you get to the lighter color of the work they're doing out front. And so we can kind of hint at some type of graphic pattern which sets this down on the grade more. And that little bit of line work and perspective then turns the weight here and have it comes out horizontally towards us. And maybe to give it some sense of more anthropomorphic scale, it could probably come to the turn of the stairs here, because it'd be a lot of line work to draw in 12 risers there. So we just start at the corner and come back and show the idea and then fan that out so it's just white when you get to the other side. Just that idea kind of senses the idea that it is sort of anthropomorphic and stair oriented, and then just turn the corner with it. And that would probably be enough. There's too much detail to make that a subject matter, but it does help to kind of, again, create a base of stone that retrieves this vertical thrust and makes it splay down to the ground level. So maybe that person receives a shadow, that person receives a shadow. And maybe somebody who walks up to the front before they actually enter the building, they might walk by this column right about there towards the entry. And so we get a bigger sense of just the heroic quality of this. So now about the purposefulness of it being a temple to the nation. So the revolution wants to end the sort of hypocrisy of the wealth of the church, take it from the people. So the state had wanted to claim back some of that power of the church. So that separation of church and state and the reclaim of some of the ecclesiastical buildings like the Pantheon, Saint Geneva becomes the Pantheon. And so the people that are now there have to sort of be installed because of their prominence in French culture. So some of the people you know, because you've gone to high school English lit classes, world lit classes, things that have been translated from the French and are just sort of normative in world study of great literature. So Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, who wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, amongst other things, are authors that are now interned in the Pantheon, as well as the architect Soufflot, which makes sense. The development of the language for the blind, Braille, Louis Braille is in there. The head of the resistance, World War II, Jean Moulin, other writers, Emile Zola. Madame Curie was the first woman with her scientific discoveries. That's the first woman interned on merit. And other heroines from the French resistance are down there too. I made mention of one German, and that's because when Hitler realized there was an end game for him, he decided that the best thing was if Germany couldn't have everything, then nobody could have anything either. So he had Paris, which had become unscathed in World War II by the bombing raids that Berlin and London were having back and forth, and other German cities and other British cities. France, because they capitulated very early, actually saved the city of Paris by becoming just a sort of a puppet to the German regime. In the meantime, Hitler had towards the end wired all of Paris to be set afire and have bombs so that if it went down, Paris would go down with Berlin. And so at one point, there's a novel and a couple of movies from the 60s that talk about this title of something that was written called Is Paris Burning? When Hitler made the call to make sure that if he's going down, just tell me at least Paris is going down with us so that we could all rise anew in the next generation. And the German in general there realized that at that point of the war, that was nonsense to keep leaving behind cultural aspects of Western Europe. So he never gave the call to trigger that detonation of Paris. And because of that, he's also interned in the crypt of the Pantheon. So, and the crypt is enormous because you take the floor plan print of what the scale of the Pantheon is as a major ecclesiastical space. Now, when you come in, you go back to the past, the center of the dome, and down the stairs, and all four wings now have got very important cultural aspects to the history of France down below. Another significant piece is in 1851, because then we're talking about the next sort of tiers of village we're going to go into about the thought process of modernizing man. A man named Foucault is a physicist who demonstrated the rotation of the earth. And so he projected from the height of the dome, right in the center, a big cable that came down the ground with a large heavy sphere at the end of that. And by showing that distance, which was great enough to get gravity to work on that, he demonstrated how indeed the earth rotates in the course of the day, because you get the arc of that ball moving in segments, actually telling time in the course of the day. It doesn't work perfectly because it's not far enough off the earth, but it does prove the point that we're actually rotating in terms of the pull of the moon and the atmosphere of the earth as the sphere moves around. So it was displayed early on and came back to the Pantheon in the 90s and exists there today as part of this expression of the claiming of common knowledge of science to replace the delicacies and poor issues with the faithful language of the Christian faith at the time. So it really kind of separates out in terms of where we're headed in the next 19th century, where science really plays a big part in the evolution of architecture. And one of the pieces that's key to that I mentioned before is right across the street here, where it's really borne out that the future of engineered architecture and factory-based industrial production is going to change the shape and image of architecture for the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th century.